For most of human history, civilization has survived wars, plagues, invasions, and collapses. Empires rose and fell, but the world itself continued to function. Crops still grew. Trade still moved. Seasons still followed familiar patterns. But there was one year when everything almost stopped. A year when the sun dimmed. When summer felt like winter. When crops failed across continents. When hunger spread faster than armies. A year so catastrophic that ancient writers believed the world itself was ending. That year was 536. Modern historians now call it the worst year to be alive. But ancient people had no such label. They only knew that something had gone terribly wrong. Everywhere, all at once. Accounts from Europe describe a sun that shone without brightness, like the moon. Shadows disappeared. Days passed in a cold, gray twilight. In China, snow fell in summer. Harvests failed repeatedly. Famine followed. In the Middle East, drought devastated entire regions. Across the world, societies that had survived for centuries suddenly found themselves on the brink of collapse. This was not a local disaster, it was global. Tree rings from this period show almost no growth. Ice cores reveal massive volcanic eruptions that filled the atmosphere with ash and sulfur, blocking sunlight for years. Temperatures dropped worldwide. The climate system collapsed abruptly, without warning, and civilization was not prepared. Food production was the backbone of every society. When crops failed for 1 year, reserves could carry people through. When they failed again, desperation set in. When they failed a third time, systems began to break. In parts of Europe, villages were abandoned. Written records vanish. Trade routes went silent. Economies based on surplus ceased to function. Cities shrank rapidly as people fled in search of food. In the Byzantine Empire, famine weakened populations so severely that when plague arrived a few years later, resistance collapsed. The Justinian plague would go on to kill tens of millions, but its path was paved by the climate catastrophe of 536. In China, entire dynasties destabilized. Rebellions erupted not because of ideology, but hunger. The mandate of heaven was believed to be lost when nature itself turned hostile. Governments fell as faith in leadership evaporated. What makes this year terrifying is not just the suffering, it is how close civilization came to total systemic failure. Multiple regions experienced collapse simultaneously. There was no stable center left to support others. Trade networks that normally redistributed food and resources broke down everywhere at once. The interconnected world of late antiquity suddenly fragmented. Had the cooling lasted a few more years, recovery might not have been possible. Human populations dropped sharply. Knowledge transmission slowed. Construction halted. Innovation paused. Civilization did not advance. It struggled to survive. And yet, something remarkable happened. People adapted. Communities simplified. Diets changed. Local resilience replaced long-distance dependence. Power structures weakened, but human networks persisted. Civilization bent instead of breaking. By the late 540s, sunlight slowly returned. Temperatures rose. Crops stabilized. But the world that emerged was not the same. Empires weakened by famine and plague never fully recovered. New political orders replaced old ones. The medieval world would rise from the ruins of late antiquity, shaped by a disaster few remembered clearly, but all had survived. The year civilization almost ended did not destroy humanity, it reshaped it. And the most unsettling part is this: no one saw it coming. There were no warnings, no gradual decline, just a sudden failure of the natural system civilization depended on. which raises a disturbing question. If it happened once, could it happen again? What made the year 536 so dangerous was not only the cold or the darkness, but the timing. Civilization at that moment was more interconnected than it had ever been before. Trade routes linked Europe, the Middle East, Africa, and Asia. Cities depended on food grown far beyond their borders. Empires relied on taxes collected from distant provinces. Stability depended on coordination. When the climate system failed, it failed everywhere. The cooling did not last for a single season. It persisted year after year. Modern data shows that temperatures remained abnormally low for nearly a decade. This meant there was no bad year, followed by recovery. There was only uncertainty, repeating itself again and again. In Scandinavia, archaeological evidence suggests massive population decline. Entire settlements disappeared. Graves from this period show signs of malnutrition. Later Norse myths may preserve distorted memories of this era, stories of endless winters, failed harvests, and a sun that lost its strength. In Ireland and Britain, chronicles describe a failure of bread. Famine did not kill instantly. It weakened society slowly, eroding trust, order, and resilience. People sold land, abandoned farms, and clustered near any remaining sources of food. In the Mediterranean world, the effects were equally devastating. Olive trees and vineyards, which require stable climates, suffered badly. These were not just crops, they were economic foundations. Their failure meant the collapse of trade, taxation, and employment. The Byzantine Empire tried to maintain order. Grain shipments were redirected, laws were enforced. But scarcity turned neighbors into competitors. Smuggling increased, hoarding spread. The state could not be everywhere at once. Then, just as populations were at their weakest, disease arrived. The Justinian plague erupted in 541, likely originating in Central Asia before spreading along trade routes. It killed not only the poor, but administrators, soldiers, and leaders. In some cities, up to half the population died. Burial systems collapsed. Fields went unplanted. Recovery became even harder. This sequence is critical to understand. The plague did not strike a healthy world. It struck a world already starved, cold, and exhausted. In China, records describe famine so severe that cannibalism occurred in some regions. Snow fell in summer. Rivers froze. Dynasties lost legitimacy because the natural order appeared broken. Rebellion followed hunger. Political collapse followed rebellion. What is most frightening is how little agency people had. This was not a failure of governance alone. Even well-managed regions suffered. Even adaptive communities struggled. The disaster did not discriminate. Civilization survived not because systems worked, but because people adjusted their expectations. Cities shrank. Trade localized. Diets simplified. People relied on what was nearby, not what was promised from afar. Complexity died, so survival could continue. This period marks a turning point in human history. The ancient world, defined by long-distance trade, large urban centers, and imperial administration, never fully returned to its previous form. What followed was a quieter, more fragmented world. The medieval era was not born from progress. It was born from endurance. The year civilization almost ended revealed a hidden truth. Human societies are strongest not when they are most advanced, but when they are most adaptable. When flexibility replaces scale. When local resilience replaces global dependence. For nearly a decade, humanity lived under a dimmed sun, uncertain seasons, and relentless scarcity. Had the volcanic winters lasted longer, had crops failed just a little more, had disease arrived sooner, civilization might not have recovered at all. There would have been no Renaissance, no industrial age, no modern world. Everything balanced on the edge of survival, and the people living through it did not know they were surviving one of the most dangerous moments in human history. They did not know they were preserving the future. They only knew they had to endure one more winter. As the years after 536 passed, humanity entered a period historians would later struggle to explain. Written records thinned. Monumental construction slowed or stopped entirely. Coinage circulation declined. Entire regions seemed to fall silent. For centuries, this era was mislabeled as a dark age, as if knowledge itself had vanished. But darkness was not ignorance. It was scarcity. The world did not forget how to build. It could no longer afford to. Recent scientific advances have allowed us to reconstruct this catastrophe with unsettling clarity. Tree rings from across the northern hemisphere show sharply reduced growth starting in 536. Ice cores drilled from Greenland and Antarctica reveal massive spikes in sulfur, evidence of enormous volcanic eruptions, likely in the tropics, that injected ash high into the atmosphere. This ash reflected sunlight back into space, cooling the planet rapidly. The eruption was not a single event. Evidence suggests multiple eruptions over several years, compounding the damage. Each time the climate began to stabilize, another shock followed. This prolonged instability is what made recovery so difficult. Agricultural calendars collapsed. Farmers could no longer predict planting seasons. Crops that depended on consistent temperatures failed repeatedly. Livestock suffered as pasture lands declined. Food insecurity became permanent rather than temporary. In societies built on surplus, permanence is assumed. Storage systems are designed for one bad year, not 5. When reserves emptied, there was nothing to fall back on. In parts of Central Asia, nomadic societies adapted more quickly than settled ones. Mobility became an advantage. Herds could be moved. Camps could shift. This highlights a crucial point. The disaster did not affect everyone equally. Those with flexible lifestyles survived better than those tied to rigid infrastructure. Meanwhile, the psychological impact of the darkened sun cannot be overstated. Ancient societies interpreted cosmic events symbolically. A sun without brightness was not just a physical phenomenon, it was a moral one. It signaled disorder in the universe itself. Faith in leadership depends on the belief that leaders can mediate between people and the natural order. When nature appeared broken, leadership appeared powerless. Authority eroded even where administration remained intact. In Europe, this loss of confidence accelerated political fragmentation. Large imperial structures gave way to localized rule. Power decentralized not through revolution, but necessity. Protection mattered more than ideology. Loyalty shifted from distant capitals to nearby strongholds. This transformation laid the groundwork for medieval feudal systems. Not because feudalism was planned, but because it fit a world where long-distance coordination was unreliable. Local protection replaced imperial promise. In the Middle East, urban centers shrank. Trade across deserts became riskier. Routes that had connected civilizations for centuries fell into disuse. Knowledge did not vanish, it slowed, compressed into smaller networks that could survive instability. In China, the Sui and later Tang dynasties would rise in the aftermath of chaos, but only after decades of suffering and reorganization. The state that emerged was shaped by lessons learned during climate catastrophe. Diversification, infrastructure repair, and food security became central priorities. This period teaches us something deeply unsettling. Civilization did not almost end because humans failed. It almost ended because nature changed faster than civilization could respond. There was no villain, no single mistake, no simple solution. Only a fragile global system pushed beyond its limits by forces no one could control. And yet, humanity endured, not by preserving everything, but by letting much of it go. Complex trade networks disappeared, urban populations declined, political ambitions shrank. What remained was enough. The world that emerged from this crisis was quieter, poorer, and less connected, but it was stable enough to rebuild. Civilization did not restart where it left off. It evolved in a different direction, shaped by memory, trauma, and caution. The year civilization almost ended was not a warning written in fire. It was a lesson written in cold, darkness, and hunger. A lesson about dependence, about fragility, about how thin the line truly is between abundance and collapse. And that lesson still waits to be remembered. As the decades after 536 unfolded, humanity entered a fragile balance that could have tipped either way. Survival no longer depended on progress, but on restraint. The societies that endured were not the most powerful or technologically advanced. They were the ones that learned, often painfully, how to live with less. Archaeological evidence shows a clear shift in priorities. Large public works all but vanished. Roads fell into disrepair. Stone construction declined sharply. This was not because people forgot engineering. It was because maintaining large systems consumed resources that no longer existed. Civilization did not regress out of ignorance. It regressed out of necessity. Food production became hyper-local. Communities that relied on distant grain shipments failed first. Those that diversified crops, hunted, gathered, and adapted diets survived longer. This shift reshaped culture itself. Culinary traditions changed. Seasonal rhythms regained importance. Knowledge became practical rather than monumental. In Northern Europe, the climatic shock altered settlement patterns for generations. Forests reclaimed farmland. Villages moved closer to reliable water. The idea of permanent urban centers lost appeal. Security came from familiarity with land, not from walls. In the Mediterranean, maritime trade diminished dramatically. Shipbuilding slowed. Ports that once connected continents became quiet. This isolation did not end exchange completely, but it reduced it to a fraction of its former scale. Ideas traveled more slowly. Innovations spread unevenly. The long shadow of the catastrophe also reshaped belief systems. Apocalyptic thinking intensified. Many cultures recorded myths of darkness, cold, and divine withdrawal. These stories were not abstract theology. They were memory, distorted, symbolic, but rooted in lived experience. One of the most sobering facts is how long recovery took. Temperatures did not normalize quickly. Agricultural productivity remained unstable for decades. Some regions experienced repeated failures well into the late 6th century. For those born during this period, crisis was not an event. It was a condition. And yet, children were still born. Families still formed. Life continued. This persistence is easy to overlook when focusing on collapse, but it is the most important part of the story. Civilization almost ended not because humanity was weak, but because it was tested at a scale rarely seen before or since. What saved humanity was not centralized power, but redundancy. Many small communities surviving independently proved more resilient than a few massive systems. When one failed, others endured. This fragmentation, often seen as backward, became a shield. Over time, new centers of stability emerged. They were smaller, more cautious, and shaped by memory of loss. The world did not rush to rebuild what had failed. It experimented, slowly. The catastrophe of 536 became a hidden hinge in history. It redirected the path of civilization without leaving a single dramatic monument behind. There is no universal ruin marking the year the world almost ended. Only subtle absences, gaps in records, cities that never recovered their former size. Technologies delayed for centuries. The industrial world we know today rests on a chain of survival that passed silently through this narrow bottleneck. If a few harvests had failed again, if disease had spread slightly faster, if temperatures had dropped a little more, there would be no continuity to inherit, no accumulated knowledge to build upon, no civilization to restart. The fact that humanity endured should not inspire complacency. It should inspire humility, because the disaster of 536 was not caused by human conflict or moral failure. It was caused by forces beyond control, and it revealed how dependent civilization is on stability it cannot guarantee. The year civilization almost ended reminds us that progress is not permanent, that abundance is conditional, that global systems can fail suddenly, without warning, and without malice, and that survival, when it matters most, often depends on letting go of the idea that things must continue as they are. This story does not end with triumph. It ends with a narrow escape, and the quiet realization that the margin between civilization and collapse is thinner than history likes to admit. As centuries passed, the memory of the catastrophe faded, but its consequences remained embedded in the structure of the world that followed. Civilization did not simply recover and continue forward. It reorganized itself around caution, around limits, around an unspoken understanding that the world could turn hostile without warning. This is why the centuries after 536 look quieter to historians. Fewer monuments, fewer ambitious projects, less confidence in permanence. People did not stop dreaming. They learned to dream smaller. One of the clearest signs of this shift appears in settlement archaeology. Urban populations across Europe, the Middle East, and parts of Asia stabilized at lower levels for generations. Cities existed, but they no longer dominated life. Rural communities became the backbone of survival. The center of gravity moved outward. This decentralization had profound effects. Political power fractured. Authority became local. Knowledge spread horizontally rather than vertically. Innovation slowed, but resilience increased. Societies became less impressive and more durable. Another overlooked consequence of the catastrophe was how it altered humanity's relationship with risk. Before 536, long-distance trade and specialization were symbols of success. Afterward, dependence on distant systems felt dangerous. Redundancy mattered more than efficiency. Having multiple imperfect options became safer than relying on one optimized system. This instinct would echo through history. When later civilizations rebuilt empires, they did so cautiously at first. Administrative systems became more redundant. Food storage became more localized. Religious and philosophical traditions emphasized humility, impermanence, and preparation for hardship. The trauma of a darkened sun never fully disappeared. It lived on in apocalyptic literature, religious imagery, and myths of lost golden ages. These were not fantasies. They were cultural scars. What makes the year civilization almost ended so important is not that it was unique, but that it exposed a universal vulnerability. Civilization depends on stable patterns, predictable seasons, reliable energy, consistent trust. When those patterns fail simultaneously, complexity becomes a liability. The more advanced the system, the more it has to lose. In 536, the world was saved not by strength, but by slack. Slack in human behavior, slack in expectations, slack in organization. People survived because they could simplify. They ate less. They traveled less. They built less. They demanded less. Civilization almost ended because it had grown too dependent on abundance. It survived because humans remembered how to live without it. This is the part history rarely emphasizes. Not the drama of disaster, but the discipline of endurance. Not the collapse of empires, but the quiet continuation of life. The world did not return to normal quickly. Some regions took centuries to regain population levels they had before 536. Some technologies were delayed or lost entirely. Some trade routes never reopened. The path of history bent permanently. We live in a world shaped by that bend. If the climate catastrophe of 536 had lasted just a little longer, humanity might have been forced into a far simpler existence for millennia, or worse. Civilization as we understand it today was not guaranteed. It was preserved by a narrow margin, and that margin was invisible to those living through it. They did not know they were holding the future together. They only knew that winter kept coming, that crops kept failing, that survival required patience. The year civilization almost ended was not remembered because it was spectacular. It was forgotten because survival leaves fewer monuments than conquest. But its lesson remains, buried beneath the assumption that progress is inevitable. It is not. Progress survives only as long as the systems beneath it do. And systems, as 536 proved, can fail quietly, globally, and without warning. What makes the year civilization almost ended so unsettling is how ordinary it looked while it was happening. There was no single day when the world stopped. No moment when humanity collectively realized how close it was to the edge. Life continued in fragments. People adapted in isolation. The danger was global, but the experience was local. A farmer did not know that crops were failing on another continent. A merchant did not know that trade networks far away were collapsing. A ruler did not know that similar decisions were being made by desperate leaders elsewhere. Civilization unraveled not as one system, but as thousands of disconnected ones, all responding to the same invisible pressure. This fragmentation hid the scale of the crisis. Modern civilization depends heavily on awareness. We track data, monitor systems, issue warnings. In 536, none of that existed. People sensed something was wrong, but not how wrong. There was no global narrative of disaster, only local suffering repeated endlessly. And because the catastrophe lacked a visible enemy, it was harder to confront. You cannot fight ash in the atmosphere. You cannot negotiate with a dimmed sun. You cannot conquer a failed growing season. Power became meaningless in the face of physics. This exposed another weakness of civilization. It is optimized for control, not for uncertainty. Laws, borders, institutions all assume predictability. When predictability vanishes, authority has nothing to enforce. In many regions, rulers continued issuing decrees that could not be followed. Taxes demanded food that did not exist. Armies expected supplies that could not be gathered. Obedience collapsed not through rebellion, but through impossibility. People cannot comply with systems that demand the impossible. This is where civilization almost failed entirely, not because people stopped caring, but because systems stopped aligning with reality. Survival required a different logic. Families broke apart to reduce mouths to feed. Communities restructured themselves around survival rather than status. Mobility increased. Flexibility replaced permanence. Civilization, as a concept, retreated into the background while humanity took center stage. From an evolutionary perspective, this was not collapse. It was selection. Ways of life that depended on abundance vanished. Ways of life that tolerated scarcity endured. Complexity was trimmed. Scale was reduced. What remained was enough to keep knowledge alive. Barely. The most remarkable fact is that writing did not disappear entirely. Literacy declined, but it did not vanish. Memory survived in monasteries, oral traditions, and isolated centers of learning. Knowledge narrowed, but it did not break. Humanity did not reset to zero. It hovered just above it. This narrow survival is why the catastrophe of 536 feels invisible in hindsight. There was no single ruin large enough to symbolize it. No empire fell on one dramatic date. Instead, the world slid sideways into a different shape. History prefers clear endings. Reality prefers slow transitions. The year civilization almost ended was not a finale. It was a near silence. A moment when humanity held its breath for years, unsure whether the light would ever fully return. When it did, civilization did not rush back to where it had been. It moved forward cautiously, carrying scars it would not name but never forget. The modern world is built on that caution, even if it no longer remembers why. Every system designed with redundancy, every instinct to store surplus, every fear of famine embedded in culture. These are echoes of 536. The lesson of that year is not that civilization is fragile. It is that civilization survives only when it remembers it is not guaranteed. And the most dangerous moment is not collapse itself, but the belief that collapse is impossible. As the memory of the catastrophe faded from direct experience, it did not fade from behavior. Even when people no longer remembered the darkened sun or the frozen summers, their descendants lived inside systems shaped by those years. Civilization did not rebuild itself on optimism. It rebuilt itself on caution disguised as tradition. This is why, for centuries after 536, societies favored redundancy over efficiency. Granaries multiplied. Local production mattered more than distant supply. Religious calendars emphasized fasting and restraint. Cultural stories warned against excess, pride, and overreach. These were not abstract moral lessons. They were encoded survival strategies. One of the most striking consequences of the catastrophe was how it slowed humanity's ambition, not permanently, but decisively. Large-scale projects became rare. When they did appear, they were incremental rather than revolutionary. Progress became cautious, almost suspicious of itself. This caution shaped the medieval world far more than warfare ever did. Trade resumed slowly and unevenly. Routes reopened only when they could be supported locally. Long-distance exchange became a luxury rather than a necessity. Knowledge traveled again, but at human speed. Innovation returned, but it spread cautiously, shaped by trust rather than scale. The world learned unconsciously that fragility increases with distance. Another often missed effect of the catastrophe was demographic memory. Populations took centuries to recover. This meant fewer hands to work land, fewer minds to innovate, fewer specialists to maintain complexity. Civilization did not lack ideas. It lacked margin. Margin is what allows failure without collapse. In 536, margin disappeared almost entirely. The recovery that followed was not heroic. It was patient. It did not aim to restore the past. It accepted loss as permanent. The world moved forward with fewer assumptions and lower expectations. This is why historians once misjudged the period that followed. They saw fewer records and assumed ignorance. They saw fewer monuments and assumed decline. What they missed was adaptation. People were not building less because they forgot how. They were building less because they remembered what happened when systems grew too large to survive shock. The catastrophe also redefined humanity's relationship with time. Before 536, progress felt linear. Afterward, it felt cyclical. Growth could reverse. Stability could vanish. The future was no longer assumed to be better than the past. This worldview permeated philosophy, religion, and governance. It made societies more conservative, but also more durable. The fear of total failure lingered long after the cause was forgotten. What makes this especially relevant is how quiet the near collapse was. There was no single moment of decision. No council that chose survival over collapse. No leader who saved the world. Humanity survived because millions of individuals adjusted their lives in small, uncoordinated ways. They ate differently. They moved when necessary. They lowered expectations. They endured. Civilization did not survive because it was strong. It survived because people were willing to let parts of it die. This is the hardest lesson of 536 to accept. Survival sometimes requires loss. Continuity sometimes requires abandonment. Progress sometimes requires restraint. The year civilization almost ended revealed that the greatest threat to humanity is not disaster itself, but inflexibility in the face of it. Nature did not negotiate. The sun did not return early. The climate did not apologize. Humanity adapted because adaptation was the only option. This is why the catastrophe feels distant today, not because it was insignificant, but because it succeeded in doing what disasters rarely do. It changed behavior. The modern world inherited systems shaped by scarcity, even as abundance returned. Over time, that memory dulled. Confidence returned. Complexity expanded again. Distance stopped feeling dangerous. And yet, the lesson remains, waiting beneath the surface. Civilization is not a permanent achievement. It is a temporary balance, maintained only as long as the world allows it. And the year civilization almost ended stands as proof that this balance can fail, silently, globally, and without warning, leaving humanity to decide once again what it is willing to let go in order to survive. As generations passed, the catastrophe of 536 dissolved into legend, but its structure remained embedded in how societies rebuilt power. Civilizations that emerged afterward were less centralized, less confident, and more cautious about tying survival to a single system. Authority fragmented, responsibility dispersed. No one wanted to place all trust in one promise again. This fragmentation shaped the political DNA of the post-536 world. Instead of universal empires, humanity entered an age of layered control. Local rulers handled survival. Larger authorities dealt with identity and belief. This separation reduced risk. When one layer failed, others endured. What historians later called slow progress was, in reality, risk management. Another consequence of the near collapse was how humans redefined success. Before 536, success meant expansion, surplus, monumentality. Afterward, success meant continuity. Being able to survive another winter became more valuable than conquering territory. Stability replaced dominance as the primary goal. This shift explains why innovation did not disappear, but changed direction. Instead of grand engineering, people refined small technologies. Farming tools improved. Storage methods evolved, clothing adapted to colder climates. These innovations were not spectacular, but they were life-saving. The catastrophe also changed humanity's relationship with memory. Written history slowed, but oral history intensified. Stories of darkness, cold, hunger, and endurance were passed down, stripped of dates but heavy with meaning. Myths about endless winters, broken suns, and trials of faith appear across cultures because they describe a shared trauma. These myths served a function. They reminded people that the world could turn hostile. They reminded leaders that nature did not obey authority. They reminded communities that survival required cooperation. The year civilization almost ended did something no empire ever managed to do. It unified humanity through vulnerability. For a brief moment in history, every major society faced the same enemy. Not another civilization, but the collapse of predictability itself. There were no winners, only survivors, and survival required humility. Civilization did not regain confidence quickly. For centuries, expansion remained cautious. When ambition returned, it did so layered on top of safeguards learned through suffering. Granaries, religious restraint, seasonal planning, and social norms all carried echoes of a world that once nearly starved. Over time, abundance returned. Trade expanded. Cities grew. Confidence resurfaced. Humanity, slowly and inevitably, forgot why caution existed. Complexity returned. And with it, fragility. This is where the story of 536 stops being ancient history, because the forces that almost ended civilization were not unique to that century. They were systemic. They revealed a truth that remains valid in every era. Global systems fail hardest when they are most optimized and least flexible. The people of 536 did not survive because they were advanced. They survived because they could simplify. They did not preserve civilization intact. They preserved humanity. The year civilization almost ended teaches us that collapse is not always loud. It is not always violent. Sometimes it arrives as cold summers, empty fields, and the quiet realization that old assumptions no longer apply. It teaches us that survival is not about holding on to everything we built. It is about knowing what to let go. Civilization almost ended not because humanity was weak, but because the world changed faster than humanity expected, and humanity survived not by winning, but by yielding. Yielding to reality, yielding to limits, yielding to the need to adapt. This is not a story of fear. It is a story of margin, a story of how close humanity came to losing everything, and how quietly it stepped back from the edge. The sun returned, the cold eased, crops grew again, but the lesson remained. Civilization is not guaranteed. It exists only as long as the world beneath it allows. And the year 536 stands as proof that the difference between continuity and collapse can be as thin as ash in the sky. As time moved on, humanity slowly rebuilt its confidence, but it did so without realizing how much it had changed. The world that emerged after the catastrophe was quieter, less ambitious, and more cautious, yet that caution was never consciously remembered. It was inherited behavior without a known cause. Civilization resumed its expansion not because the danger was gone, but because memory fades faster than risk. Centuries later, societies once again began to believe that systems were permanent. That climate was stable. That food would always arrive. That trade would always flow. That growth was natural, inevitable, and safe. The year civilization almost ended became invisible precisely because it worked. Humanity survived, and survival erased urgency. The lesson dissolved into habit, then into myth, then into silence. But the structure of the warning never disappeared. It exists in how fragile systems behave under pressure, in how abundance creates dependency, in how complexity hides risk. The catastrophe of 536 did not end civilization because it revealed something fundamental about humanity's place in the world. Humans do not control the systems they depend on. They participate in them. Temporarily, when the climate shifted, no empire could command the sun to return. When harvests failed, no law could force crops to grow. When disease spread, no border could contain it. Power failed because power was irrelevant. What remained was adaptability, not as ideology, but as instinct. This is the uncomfortable truth history avoids. Civilizations survive disasters not by being strong, but by being willing to shrink, to release scale, to abandon excess, to simplify when complexity becomes dangerous. The year civilization almost ended was not the story of humanity standing tall against extinction. It was the story of humanity bending low enough to avoid breaking. This bending left marks everywhere. In cultural humility, in religious restraint, in suspicion of unchecked ambition, in the slow, cautious rebuilding that followed. Yet over time, success returned, and success erased fear. The modern world is far more complex, interconnected, and optimized than the world of 536 ever was. Our systems are faster, larger, more efficient, and therefore more sensitive to disruption. The lesson of that year is not that civilization will end. It is that civilization survives only when it remembers that it can. The people of 536 did not survive because they knew the future. They survived because they adapted without knowing whether survival was guaranteed. They endured uncertainty without reassurance. They continued without certainty. That is the quiet heroism history rarely celebrates. The year civilization almost ended did not produce a monument, a victory, or a founding myth. It produced continuity, and continuity is fragile. It depends on humility, on restraint, on remembering that the world does not owe us stability. The catastrophe passed. Civilization returned. Humanity forgot. But the conditions that nearly ended everything did not vanish. They wait, not as fate, but as possibility. The story of 536 is not a warning carved in stone. It is a reminder written in air, invisible until it is everywhere. In the end, the year civilization almost ended does not belong to the past. It belongs to a pattern where humanity builds systems so efficient, so interconnected, and so dependent on stability that it forgets stability is never guaranteed. A pattern where abundance feels permanent and warning signs feel abstract, until they are not. In 536, civilization did not collapse because humans were cruel, foolish, or evil. It collapsed because the world changed faster than human systems could respond. And when those systems failed, people did the only thing that ever truly saves humanity. They adapted. They let go of what could not survive. They kept what could. Civilization did not survive intact. Humanity did. That distinction matters. Because history is filled with ruins that tempt us to believe collapse is rare, dramatic, and distant. But the truth is quieter. Collapse happens when participation ends, when belief fades, when systems demand more than reality can provide. The people of 536 never knew how close they were to the edge. They had no warning, no data, no reassurance. They endured darkness, cold, hunger, and uncertainty, not knowing if the sun would ever fully return. And yet, they carried the future through that silence. Every library, Every city, every idea exists today because they survived a world that nearly did not. The year civilization almost ended teaches us one final truth. Civilization is not something we own. It is something we borrow. Borrowed from stable seasons. Borrowed from functioning systems. Borrowed from a world that allows complexity to exist. And that permission can be withdrawn. Not with fire, not with conquest, but with ash in the sky and cold in the summer. Humanity survived because it remembered, instinctively, that survival does not require everything to continue as it was, only that life continues at all. And that may be the most important lesson ever learned in a year when the sun almost disappeared.